Started as a dancer, dance therapist, and initially worked in empty rooms. So my initial office space had nothing in it, which is kind of ironic because now I have way too much stuff in it. But you know, what I found worked was that as objects got introduced, and they really came from children wanting them to be there, it was still about the moving child. It just was the moving child now engaged with clay, or engaged with sand, or engaged with puppets. So from what was pure movement, it kind of, all these objects got added, but the child was still moving, and still is moving, whether they're sitting or bouncing. So the ball is actually, I actually got it to use for adults, to lie back over, to open up their chest for breathing, but it gets used mostly by children. And it gets used in whatever way they want to use it. Some children stand on it and balance and have me hold their hands. Some kids vault over it. Some kids lean on it and fly off of it because it's not very secure and I have to pad the walls when they do that. Some kids hurl it at me, and vice versa. So it's a prop that gets used in a variety of ways, basically depending on how a kid needs to use it. And it's sometimes just goofy, but sometimes, as with this one kid I'm going to share later, it really was quite a pivotal experience using the ball. This was a child who really basically only moved. He did one sand world a few weeks ago, and it was the only one he'd ever done for in a year and a half. The child who'd been, there'd been a lot of neglect in his 4 years, raised by his mother, who was a drug addict, a lot of abuse, possibly sexual abuse, certainly exposure to sex. And he came in very frozen in his movements. He moved a lot, but there was a fragmentation to how his body held together. And there were moments of dissociation where he would just stop and wander off into a corner and then come back. So much of his play had moments of him kind of disappearing and then coming back. But initially his play, a lot of it was done on this ball. He actually decided this was a school bus and I was the bus driver. I'm not sure what meaning that had for him aside from in the moment, but so the object was for him to stand on this, and it was extremely difficult to get him to stand safely on this and lead him through the space to all the bus stops. And at the time I wasn't sure why it meant so much to him, but it meant a great deal. And it was very slapstick, with lots of shouting and laughing, but very serious. And thinking afterwards in my own associations, this was a kid for whom, when he was coming up onto his legs and learning how to walk, was in the care of someone who was really very, very negligent / abusive. So it was like he was finding his legs all over again, but finding them on something that was really very unstable, which was kind of amazing. The stability had to come through me, through my capacity to kind of hold him firmly enough, but not too firmly, which was wonderful. So, and then in moments, we would stop at certain places, certain bus stops, and stories would start coming out. And there were stories that probably related to some of the abuse he'd experienced. He wouldn't tell me the abuse, but he'd go home and tell his paternal grandmother who he lived with stories about what his mother had done, elicited by this kind of zany slapstick play that felt charged, but there was nothing specific to it that you could put your finger on. Then sometimes he would stop and this Congo would turn into a soup pot, and all the scary puppets that I have would be thrown in, and we'd cook it, and I'd be forced to eat the monster soup. He never participated in that. But that went on, and sometimes in the midst of the bus trips. And then he replaced that with, had me build a monster out of clay. His arm has fallen off. And he discovered that if I made openings for the mouth and the genitals and the anus, that he could make potions and pour them into the mouth, and they would actually come out. And he did it many, probably hundreds of times over the course of several months, actually. He would revisit it again and again and again. Until finally one day he was kind of done with it, and he just took a big hammer and smushed it, splashing water all over me, a little bit over him. His play always got me wet. It was interesting. It was amazing how he managed to splash on me. He would leave and he would be wet and I'd be soaking. The last time he did this, it was a shift in consciousness, and he was aware that he'd gotten me wet and apologized. That was an interesting change for a kid who otherwise seems oblivious to the effect of his actions. So this simple thing, which seems very silly, and it's hard to replicate what that felt like because I'm just doing it now, but for this kid, it really was this profound detox of sorts. I mean, he was poisoning the monster and simultaneously ridding himself of the poison, if that makes sense. This work took place over about a year and a half, and I saw him every other week. And there were some periods of setback in which he had visits, an hour visit with his mother, biological mother, who was, would be good to get out of jail and then go back into jail. And he would see her, and sometimes there was a noted regression until his father began to, after those visits, take him down to the river and throw stones in. So they found a way, after those hour visits, to go and discharge whatever had been cooked up. Then I had a period of about 6 months in which he didn't see his mother at all, and that's when real growth happened. The litmus test will be when he starts seeing his mother again for visits, which is meant to happen soon. But it feels he doesn't dissociate anymore. He doesn't, there's not a fragmentation to his movement. So I'm actually really quite confident he'll be able to handle those visits at this point. He's all of a piece, and I don't think he lives in a very safe world. And I think he'll be able to go into those moments and come back without losing that, I'm confident. In talking a little bit about how this boy's body movement was to begin with versus of late, and I use the word fragmented, and I really meant that. It was as if the parts were not really connected to each other. It's hard to describe, but he moved in way in which, and you might move this way when you walk, and he moved kind of like this. So it was kind of disjointed. He stopped periodically. It was as if something was holding him back with some kind of regularity. Aside from the dissociate in which he'd walk off and go into a corner or a different room for a little bit and then come back, he was really having a hard time being in his body. There was no feeling of flow. When you're with a playing child, what you notice is how incredibly graceful they're playing. Whatever they're doing, whether they're hammering, throwing, there's always like a full body. Even most of the children I work with, many who have a lot of problems, there's fluidity to the movement. This boy's body was not fluid at all. It was as if there were many, many pieces of ice inside, and there were, as it turns out. But I think the flow of the liquid through the monster and the movement, which was very, very liquid in many ways on the ball, began to loosen that up. But by the time he got to this world, this interesting water world, he was moving in a very connected way. He was moving like a normal, healthy child. There was a calmness, there was a eye contact that hadn't been there. So the movement was, in his moving, it was almost as if the movement was coming from the periphery. And you could imagine a child who is being very vigilant in that sense, not knowing where the next blow is going to come from. So there's no capacity for his shoulders to relax. There's no capacity to move from the core because the core is being protected. And this is me speculating, but that's what it feels like. It felt like to move in sync with him was to experience a protected body who was also frozen. And that's not been the case of late.